So today we're heading to Japan.
At the ACM Interactive Surfaces and Spaces, or ISS conference, you could tell that architecture was going to be a big theme of this year's conference.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a huge honor to speak here. But I think it's increasingly important to understand the context of technology and how that interacts with the real world around us. If we're designing, this is an underground station in London, but everybody in the picture, as you can see, is looking at their cell phone, then what does that mean?
I'm here with Daniel, and one of the things that I found really compelling about the presentation, which is not to do with necessarily the subject, but how you presented it, was just the use of a lot of videos, kind of concept videos with motion and stuff like that.
I guess it shows also my background as an interaction designer, in that describing interactions, as you know, is kind of the using that in other modes is really hard. Video is a very good way of describing how someone interacts in a particular place. So it's tuned to that. And what we started doing is saying, well, how do we use video in that kind of context? How do we describe real urban situations? And there's a long history of trying to describe these touch points, individual touch points, whether it's Christopher Alexander's work or William White's work or Nightingale's work. They've all focused on the particular details of how people interact with the city. But they've done it through drawings. It's been very static as a result. Just technically they had to. So the ability to describe something in video is really powerful. So we use these things really as kind of sketch video prototypes. It's an awkward name, but within a few days you can construct something with a bit of work that is a plausible description of how a digital system might happen in place, because you can annotate it with subtitles or call out the interactions, describe what's happening in the system that otherwise is invisible. But what you find out is, will she share, for instance? And then in this case, she goes outside, there's an autonomous shuttle drop-off point, but you saw it was doing something else a minute ago. It just became a bus stop for a minute. So the rest of the time it's doing local information and wayfinding, weather and things like that. But then it becomes a bus stop. And so the advantage of that is that two people can walk past and say, well, I wasn't going that way for half an hour, but seeing as Anna just made a bus, I might as well hop in. So then we get 3 people into one vehicle, not 3 people into 3 vehicles, which is a huge win for the city. If we can get 2 vehicles off the street for every one that we put on, that's a huge result. But we're trying to figure these things out. You see the kind of almost like the subtitles in the bottom left there. Will she get into a small vehicle with strangers? We know that those of you who take Uber Pool, just out of interest, who takes Uber Pool or shared Lyft? Anybody in the audience? Very hesitant hands going up, maybe 5 or 6 people. But around 25 to 50%, I mean, it's a huge number, it depends, of all Uber and Lyft journeys in San Francisco are shared, which is extraordinary. Because you're getting into a small vehicle with strangers, and that's different than getting into something like a bus or a tube with strangers. So we have to deal with adaptation. We have to be able to flex and iterate and pivot and prototype, the kind of language you're used to from technology. So in Melbourne, we worked on a project on these streets here. Now this is a big street in Melbourne. You can't really see in this picture, but it's about 4 or 5 lanes. It's so big there's even room for parking down the middle of the street, as well as at the edges of the street. I've got no idea why they built it like that in Melbourne. As you know, private cars are basically static 95% of the time. It's kind of an extraordinarily wasteful system. 95% of the time a car is just sitting there like this. In the middle bit, all around, we can begin to densify and green up this place a bit, until finally we can make the big move here, which is shared surface. You can still drive down the left-hand side in this picture, should you need to, but you have all of this other stuff going on the right. And then you can begin to see now the value of the street. The street's completely changed in, 5 or 6 different steps. So as you saw, we started with some very simple things here. And actually the cheap stuff as well, you can start putting that into the street tomorrow. The more expensive stuff, the flexible program, the shared surface, that's towards the end. But by that point you can pay for it because of all the value I just described earlier has been unlocked at that point. So this is a kind of a question about keeping technology hungry, about the third principle. And we know that one of the issues here with cell phones is that they are not humble. They're grabbing people's attention all the time. But we're seeing this complete bubble around ourselves now in what were previously social spaces. So it's really problematic. So one of the things that we're looking at, and lots of other people are looking at, is how do you keep notifications down to the smallest possible trigger in a system like this? Knowing that, again, you want people to be heads up in the city, talking to each other, looking around, paying attention for numerous good reasons. So one project I took as inspiration here isn't really a project even, it's just an example. This is the first telephone box in the Netherlands, the very first one. And it's in a museum of telephone boxes in the Netherlands, which is the kind of thing they have in the Netherlands. And it's beautiful, of course. It's amazing tiled thing here, and it's beautiful glass, and the typography is phenomenal, as you'd expect for the Dutch. But the interesting thing there is that little stained glass thing, the bird on the wire there. What that is saying is that it's explaining the way that telephones work. It's saying that you can sit in this box in Amsterdam and call someone in Rotterdam, but just be aware there's an operator on the line listening. That's it. And that's what the little bird is doing. It says there's a line physically between here and Rotterdam, but there'll be an operator listening, so be careful what you say. This is from Victor Papanak's famous book in the 70s, where he says usually as a designer we're attacking a very, very small piece of the real problem. We need to get into the rest of that triangle when we're dealing with things as complex as urbanization and climate change, all of the issues we're facing now. 3D model of the proposed development dropped to your phone in situ. So you can say, this is going to be a bicycle rack, or this is going to be a community garden, this is a community garden that someone's modified with a bicycle rack. And then on the left-hand side it says, this is what the value of the project would be. This is in Stockholm, exactly the same thing on new urban developments in Stockholm, where we're beginning to understand this is how something could change. And we'll make that very tangible on the end. We'll draw basically a new chunk of city that comes out of it, which has come from their work. And it's got all of those ideas that I talked about in there, but it's also recognizable. It's not the Jetsons or some incredibly complex city that they don't understand. So we're trying to understand, how do you have that everyday complexity in this sense? Drawing it is one thing. If you really want to change the city, it's not really about architecture in the traditional sense. It's not about how good your building can be. It's about how do you change the building code? Or how do you change planning? Or how do you change the way we work with developers?
What struck me was how Dan Hill used video to transport us into another world. You didn't just see the future through static images, but you felt like a part of it. If architects are responsible for showing us the future, then they also have a responsibility to communicate it in the most convincing way. Sometimes an image just isn't enough to transport you into this other world. Hey, thanks so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe. And if you'd like to be notified when new videos come out, click the bell.